Okay, thank you very much. Unless Ellie has any other thoughts, I think I'm the warm-up act, and then Hannah and Ellie are going to follow on. So I'll do my bit first. I'm going to put my slides up and control them myself. So let me just put them up there. Hopefully you can now see the slides. What I'm going to do is a general introduction to this whole area of safeguarding vulnerable dependent drinkers. Over the last 2 or 3 years with Michael Preston Shute, who's speaking later, I've done a lot of work on how we can better use legal frameworks to protect self-neglecting chronic drinkers. I've written safeguarding adult reviews about this as well, and I'm working on one in Manchester at the moment. What we know about this client group is that the vast majority of dependent drinkers are not engaged in alcohol services. And of those who do engage, approximately half of them drop out very swiftly. The problem is that those clients who drop out, those clients who don't engage, the response to them has often been very dismissive. This is a quote from an alcohol worker in South London who said, and literally with a shrug of his shoulders, if a client's in denial, there's not a lot we can do to help them. And that is not true. And the problem is that motivation-focused approach, that requirement that people are motivated before we do anything, fails a very large, a very needy, a very vulnerable, and a very risky group of individuals. As a result of concerns about clients like that, we published this document, Working with Change-Resistant Drinkers, which is loosely called the Blue Light Manual. And this sets out tools, techniques, pathways, ideas for working with change-resistant drinkers. However, we know that at the end of the blue light pathway, even if you've tried all the tools and techniques in the manual, there is still going to be a group of clients who are not moving forward and who are so vulnerable or so risky that they require more structured thinking, more structured frameworks to manage their behaviour. And the place where we see these clients most acutely is in the safeguarding adult reviews. 3 and a bit years ago, we published this document, Learning from Tragedies. This sets out tools, techniques, pathways, this document provides an analysis. I was getting confused there. This document provides an analysis of a series of safeguarding adult reviews that were published back in 2017. We looked at 41 reviews in total. And of those 41, in 11, alcohol was a problem for the adult being safeguarded. That is 25% of the cases. Now, the reason I emphasize that 25% figure is because Michael Preston Shute himself in 2020 undertook a much larger analysis of SARS. He looked at 231 of these cases. And what is interesting in statistical terms, in nothing else, is that he found exactly the same rate of alcohol problems in those 231 cases, 25%. Now, my hunch is that when the government enacted the CARE Act back in 2014, there was no expectation that alcohol misuse would be so central, but it is. And anyone working in the safeguarding arena, anyone who is able to make safeguarding concerns needs to be aware of the role that alcohol can play in this scenario. Of the cases that both Michael and I looked at, the most powerful and probably the highest profile is the Angela Wrightson case. Many of you may not remember the name of Angela Wrightson, but for most of you, you will have heard her name. And many of you will have seen this picture of Angela Wrightson on the main evening news or in a newspaper, because Angela Wrightson was a woman from Hartlepool who was beaten to death by two teenage girls. Those girls were just 13 and 14 at the time of the killing, and both were in local authority care. You can imagine there was a huge public outcry about this, a lot of media coverage. But a lot of the attention in those cases was on the two girls. And there is a danger that Angela Wrightson sort of slipped back into the shadows in that case. But you can work out for yourself, even looking at that picture, that Angela Wrightson was a very vulnerable and very chaotic woman who was known to her neighbours, sadly, as Alcoholic Angie. And she had a huge history of alcohol problems, mental health problems, vulnerability, multiple care and support needs, multiple contact with agencies. In the 3 years prior to her death, she had over 1,000 contacts with services like alcohol services, the hospitals. And in her adult life, and she died when she was in her late 30s, there were 472 incidents reported about her to the police. By anybody's standards, that's an astounding level of activity. But the truly astounding thing about the Angela Wrightson case is the poverty of the response to her. Despite that multi-agency impact, there was never a multi-agency meeting. Despite her evident vulnerability, alcohol services in Hartlepool closed her case because, in their view, effectively, she was not motivated to change. And I think it's very easy with this client group to simply view them as choosing this lifestyle, as liking to live in their own filth, as someone said to me about a particular man. The situation is much more complex than that. The reality is that these clients face very real barriers to change. In particular, real physical barriers to change. They may be depressed because of that depressant effect of alcohol. And 70% of dependent drinkers describe themselves as depressed. They may have alcohol-related brain damage or alcohol-related brain damage, which I'll say a little bit more about in the next couple of slides. They may have physical health problems like liver disease, and drinkers are 13 times more likely to have liver disease than other people. And one of the key symptoms of that will be tiredness, low energy levels, a demotivator. With liver disease, there may also be confusion, as there may with pancreatitis and UTIs. They may not sleep well or eat well, both of which can impact on long-term cognition, and both of which can lower mood and ability to engage in the short term. Some of them even may be adults who've grown up with fetal alcohol damage, affecting their learning and their development and their behaviour into adult life, not just as children. And on top of all of this, they will be physically dependent. And these clients are facing very real physical barriers to change. Most significantly, cognitive impairment. We know that people are more likely to drink problematically because they've had traumatic brain injuries in the past. If they are drinking, alcohol-related brain damage accumulates, making it harder to recover. There will be physical damage from the drinking lifestyle, falls, fights, fits, again, worsening their cognition. There may be other forms of cognitive impairment, poor sleeping patterns, hepatitis C, strokes can all contribute to cognitive impairment. And this damage then generates a downward spiral. As the drinking increases, the risk of further head injury also increases. As those head injuries accumulate, that impacts on impulse control, leading to more drinking and more injuries. And we know that people with brain injuries are more likely to develop addictions. 50% of people with traumatic brain injury were drinking over the safe limits when they were injured. Up to 50% of dependent drinkers in treatment services may have traumatic brain injury. And importantly, people who have had one alcohol-related traumatic brain injury are more than 4 times as likely to have another traumatic brain injury. They're moving downhill faster and faster. And recently we have developed clinical national guidance on working with this client group, which will be published in the near future. But all of this does highlight the importance of professionals being legally literate with this client group. They need to understand the legal structures that can support and manage these very challenging clients. And Michael Preston Shute and myself have been working together over the last 2 or 3 years to develop this document on safeguarding vulnerable dependent drinkers. This is readily available on the Alcohol Change UK website, and it sets out how you can use powers such as the CARE Act, the Mental Capacity Act and the Mental Health Act with this client group. It also looks at 4 other areas of legislation, including, importantly, the Human Rights Act that I know Ellie has used, but also things like antisocial behaviour powers and ultimately environmental health legislation. I think with this client group, it is very easy to allow people to die with their rights on. Sometimes we are going to need to deny autonomy to create autonomy, as we do with the Mental Health Act. And I hope that the guidance that we've made available through the work with Michael Preston Shute and Alcohol Change UK will help you do that. I hope the Blue Light Manual will do that. And I hope that what Ellie is going to say next will also help focus down onto very practical approaches to working with this client group. And I will stop there.